Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of No Blurred Lines, a series where we talk about rape culture and American television. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click here, and that will take you back to the first episode where I answer all of those really gripping questions you have, like, what even is rape culture? Why does that matter? Why am I here? We're going to be talking about everyone's favorite Western, sci-fi, romance, drama, action, everyone's favorite, Westworld. If you've somehow managed not to see or even hear about it, it's basically about this robot babe Dolores and her boyfriend Jimmy Marsden. Okay, well, I'm watching it for Robot Babe and Jimmy Marsden. Actually, it's about an amusement park a la Jurassic World, except the dinosaurs are really like lifelike humanoid robots. The park was made by Anthony Hopkins and his BFF Arthur some 40 years ago. Raised up to today, and the updates on the robots have made them so realistic. Actually, they're mostly just real at this point. People pay big bucks to come and talk to or kill or sleep with the robots and whatever they want, really. The trouble is that the hosts, that's what the show calls the robots, are starting to think for themselves. And a lot of stuff happens, and James Marsden dies like a ton. Like a ton. And then he starts killing people too, and there's this whole thing with the man in black. And also Bernard, who ends up having an affair with his boss, who might actually be a traitor to the company, and none of that stuff is really important right now. The aspect that's particularly important to us right now is the cognitive abilities of these robots, and how real they really are. The hosts have become so realistic that they can actually, like, think and feel, and it's more than just that they look real or seem real, it's that they are real to themselves and to the others around them. They are as human as we are, except for the fact that they're not. They've become so realistic that they can think and fall in love, and everything that makes us human, they can do. Even die. They have a legitimate autonomy that's separate from what their programmers have given them, and if that legitimate autonomy, that personality, that wetware is inside of them, then are they still just software? And if they have made that transition from software to wetware, then what makes them not real? The whole point of the amusement park is that people want to live out their fantasies. They want to feel like the hero, or in a lot of cases, the villain. What makes these fantasies, I need an amusement park away from society kind of fantasies, is that a lot of them are really dark. Like murder, rape, pillage, kind of dark. Like you clicked on a video about rape culture and I'm talking about this show, kind of dark. Instead of hurting people in the outside world, people come into Westworld and they just let out all of their violent hopes and dreams onto these not real robots. So a question that you have to ask yourself as you're watching this show is, are these acts of violence less violent because they're happening in a controlled situation rather than the outside world? As Let's point out in the show, people are born and robots are made, and that seems to be the biggest difference between them. Every character in the show, robot or human alike, has hopes and dreams and desires and the ability to think and reason and feel. And this is where rape culture comes into the show. Now, there's plenty to go on if we just look at the actual content of assault and rape, but that's not very interesting, is it? So instead, I want to look at consent in the show and how that relates to rape culture. Because as I was watching it, the only thing I could think of, even in the consensual things, was blah. Rape culture is a society that normalizes and trivializes rape. Westworld's brush with rape culture doesn't come quite from the assault scenes, but rather in the way that it deals with consent. Consent is the voluntary agreement to engage in an act. The key word there is voluntary. If it's in any way coerced or manipulated, then it's not consensual. Consent must be offered freely and genuinely. Otherwise, it's not an act of consent, but rather it's an act of violence and non-consensual. Consent is really tricky in Westworld. There are plenty of scenes that depict rape and assault and harassment towards women and men in the show. But because we're not dealing with people, but rather hosts, we can't just look at the violent acts. We can't look at just the non-consensual, clearly wrong things that happen in the show. We have to look at the seemingly consensual acts as well, because if you're programmed to want something and behave a certain way, do you really want it or not? Because if you're programmed to want these things and you have no actual choice in the matter and you can't even defend yourself, is it consensual? This here is the gray area of the show. Take, for example, William and Dolores' relationship. While we're shown in the flashbacks the beginning of the relationship, we see William and Dolores as a romantic, loving couple who genuinely care about each other, despite the fact that Dolores is programmed to want all these things and it's not really her decision. He believes that their emotions for each other are genuine and real, and that's what sets him over the edge when he realizes that she doesn't. He believes this, that she loves him, even though there's countless characters in the show that point out she's not real. And more importantly, the connotation behind that, which is she's not real, comma, therefore she doesn't love you. She's programmed to want this. While there's definite wishy-washy on if she's real or not, she is programmed to want that, so that's not her own autonomy. When we see him in his older form as the Man in Black, he is the primary rapist and assailant in her life. He's violent and monstrous and so much more the villain that we're used to seeing as a rapist. And even though his two characters are polar opposites in the way that they treat Dolores, both acts are equally non-consensual. There's also the broader examples of the side characters and the women who work in the brothel, all of whom have sexual or romantic relationships with guest and host alike. These are mostly all non-consensual as well, because as the show points out, the hosts are incapable of hurting another guest. They are programmed to want to please the guest in whatever fashion that they want. As the same with Dolores, they're not capable of actually getting out of the situation. Therefore, their consent is revoked. The way I see it, these are all non-consensual, even when they're not necessarily malicious in intent. At the absolute best, it's dubious consent, which is still non-con. Perhaps the only truly consensual act is between Maeve and Hector, who were both hosts and had some level of developing sentience and chose to sleep with each other, even though it wasn't absolutely imperative to the narrative. It was just something that they wanted to do. So at the very least, I don't think that relationship has negative connotations to the audience, because they're on equal footing. They have equal amounts of information. Dubious and non-consensual relationships are really important, even though they're just on our TV screen. It's important in rape culture because it represents real life counterparts. Nothing that we see has no action or consequence to the viewer. If we are letting ourselves be saturated with images and with storylines and with information, they will seep into our lives, even if it's just the knowledge that they exist. And that tempts the way that we view things. You can no more get rid of the influence of television than you can the influence of your parents or your friends when you're young. These non-violent but still non-consensual sexual relationships in the show are most derivative of the relationships in real life that have an uneven power balance. Like, for example, a teacher and a student, or a sober individual and a drunk individual. These people have a lack of power. And if you have no power, you have no voice. And if you have no voice, you can't say no. If you can't say no, then you're not saying yes. Though often the hosts are technically, narratively willing to sleep with the guests, it's because they don't realize that they're allowed to say no. And that's because they're not allowed to say no. But the show in any sort of way romanticizes this lack of consent is dangerous because of the way that audiences internalize the moral messages of stories. There are so many people in our world, in our non-fictionalized world. I say from inside your computer. There are so many people in our world that don't realize they're allowed to say no. People in abusive relationships can feel like saying no isn't an option. Even people in healthy relationships don't realize that they can say no after they've already said yes once. Consent is completely revocable, and not a lot of people know that. Consent is a ever-moving, free-flowing, always changing thing. Consent is kind of like a coupon you take to the store. So if it's a valid coupon, you give it, and then you get your item, and you're like, chill, and the cashier's like, chill, and everything's like super good, super ace. You all did your parts completely appropriately. But if your coupon's expired, you can't use it because the store manager would be like, your coupon was only good Monday through Thursday and today's Saturday, so you can't use your coupon just because I gave you a coupon last week. Like, coupons expire. Consent is the coupon in this analogy. And consent seems really simple, but it's actually kind of complicated in the way that we don't teach a lot about it and we don't learn a lot about it. Up until the 70s, it was legal in all 50 states to rape your wife because by getting married, she had given her consent already. She consented to have joint health care and to share mugs with you, okay? Non-consensual acts that are not horrifically violent, but rather manipulative and obtained through intimidation make up a huge portion of the actual rapes that happen in real life. And many people use their power, their status, or their information that the other person doesn't have in order to obtain dubious consent that they wouldn't otherwise get. And that is definitely what's happening in Westworld. There's no way the robots would sleep with all these people. It just wouldn't happen. It just wouldn't. It's non-consensual because as soon as they develop their sentience, they're like, what the hell? No thank you. Leave me alone, please. But despite all of my complaining that the show is wish-washy about this consent, it is young. We only had the first season, and I have such hope that the show addresses this and continues a progressive... The show is still young, so it has the potential to address all of these concerns and to point out these seemingly consensual acts as violent in the later episodes. So those are the majority of my thoughts about Westworld. If you want to see more, slightly less rambly and more on the analytical rather than the critiquing side, feel free to check below where I will link a blog post that I wrote about Westworld and media theory. Feel free to comment if you have any sort of thoughts. Please comment and like and subscribe and click the belly thing, because I will be back with more shows. If you're ever watching one of your favorite shows and thinking, this is good, but what if I looked at all the things that made it kind of terrible? You'll want to subscribe to me. See you later.